Hello and welcome to this panel with the four shortlisted writers on the 2019 Gratiaen Prize. My name is Smriti and I'm here today with Upali, Vihanga, Andrew and Praveen. These writers are each quite distinctive in their own right. They've made it onto the shortlisted books that are very different in format, in tone, and in topic. But to my mind, what unites them and what they have in common really is that their work represents the best new writing in English in Sri Lanka this year, as per the Gratiaen Prize. This quick conversation we're going to be having will be just 25 minutes long, but it will give us an opportunity to touch base with each of them to talk a little bit about the process, about books they've written, and also about this remarkable prize that they're all in the running for. Welcome to our panelists, and I'd really love to actually just start with the youngest on the panel. Praveen is, I think, 16 going on 17, as we've discovered, and all of us are united in admiration for his commitment and his discipline to his craft. Praveen, you mentioned procrastination being a problem, and I wondered, for you, what keeps you writing? Why do you love the work enough to kind of sit down and commit to it?
Well, the kind of problem with, I think, with writer's block and procrastination and all of that is sometimes to overcome those difficulties, you really have to put pen and paper down and you have to go do something else and maybe completely different writing, do something else for a while. And then what I find most often is then you come back and then you're refreshed. You have all of these new ideas. You might have gained new inspiration while you were doing something. You might have remembered something that might have inspired you, things like that. So when you take a little bit of time off and then you come back to it, that's when the best ideas come into light. And I think that really helps with writer's block and keeps you writing, keeps you interested in what you're writing, and ultimately makes a better product.
Praveen, I was also kind of curious because you're writing for a young audience, and I wondered in a way whether you were also writing the book that you yourself wanted to read.
Yeah, I did. From when I was small up until now, I'm very interested in fiction. I have read a lot of it, and this the book that I wrote is something that I would want to read because those are the books that I grew up with from a very young age. Authors like Roald Dahl and other fantasy authors, they really had an impact on me, and so yeah, I do think that the book I wrote is maybe an homage to that, and is something that I would like to read when I was young.
Thank you, Praveen. Andrew, I think that actually leads me very naturally to you because in a way, the book you wrote about Sri Lanka, Upon a Sleepless Isle, was the book that I wanted to read because I recognized myself and I recognized what I care about and my lived experiences in that book. And it's so striking because so much of the travel writing about Sri Lanka is filled with generalizations, lacking in nuance and context. And I wondered how aware you were of those traps and what choices you made early on in your writing and research process that kind of allowed you to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I was aware of not falling into those traps, and I guess a lot of the travel writing that we've read about Sri Lanka comes from writers who live overseas or foreigners, often Westerners. So I think everybody, whoever it is that's writing on a place or on any subject, brings their own assumptions to a subject. And I think when you're writing something like my book, when you're writing about a place and you're trying to be as truthful as possible, I think it's important to shed those assumptions and to try and do the research, to try and sort of get almost learn about a place almost on a granular kind of molecular level, so that you can write about it as honestly and truthfully as possible in ways that will resonate not just for a foreign audience or an audience that's unfamiliar with the place, but also for people who are living there. I guess I had a head start on many of the writers in the sense that I was already living here, and I felt like I had quite broad roots. You know, my one side of my family is Sinhala Buddhist, one side is Tamil Catholic. So I felt like I kind of understood the moving parts of Sri Lanka a little bit before I started the project. But then there were parts of the country that were, you know, hugely unfamiliar to me. The north, especially the north and east. I grew up in Sri Lanka in the 90s, where by and large, what you heard about the north and east was essentially propaganda. And every country that's at war goes through this. It does, you know, puts out propaganda. You know, propaganda is very much part of the war effort universally. And propaganda, though, is the enemy of truth. And when you're trying to write truthfully, it's important that I kind of examine the things that I thought I knew about the North and East within myself and shed them as much as possible. I'm not sure it's possible to be completely objective, because at the end of the day, I'm still in my own skin. But it's to try and be aware of all the things that that you thought you knew, and try and kind of question all of those things before you write about a place. And I was done a huge favor, and by, you know, the immense amount of outstanding Sri Lankan scholarship there is on history, on archaeology, on anthropology, and fantastic journalists who write in all three languages, as well as all the people that I met that gave me that time, that kind of allowed me to ask questions and answered them very, you know, truthfully and honestly. It's kind of on credit to them that if I was able to write truthfully, it's to their credit. I don't think I was perfect by any means. There are probably many places where I did make generalizations and I didn't quite land on the truth. But yeah, I tried.
I mean, I love that you were able to kind of straddle this insider-outsider perspective. Am I correct in assuming you've also lived away from the country for a long time, and so returning, you were also looking at it from those eyes?
Yeah, I was living in New Zealand for 13 years. My family moved there when I was, you know, reasonably young. And so, yeah, it does kind of, having an experience of another place allows you to, again, like, just question things about Sri Lanka that maybe those questions wouldn't naturally occur to you if you'd lived in the same place your entire life. And so it does give you a little bit of distance, and you're allowed to kind of take a more detached viewpoint, and it helps when it comes to humor as well, I think, which is a device that I try to use in the book quite often, because there are some things to an outsider about Sri Lanka that are very funny and kind of are strange or quirky, and that was probably where it really helped. That outsider perspective helped me helped me see those things askance or in a different light than maybe someone who lived in Sri Lanka all their life would. So I had that benefit, or that advantage as well.
Thank you. Upali, it strikes me that you turn your gaze on Sri Lanka. You're able to look at some of the most uncomfortable things in our society, and your writing grapples with really difficult themes. I wanted to ask you what you feel the role of that can be in literature, and how literature can help us have really difficult conversations, for instance, about our sexuality.
That's one thing, yes. But most of the time, I find that there are certain subjects which are not discussed in any of the published works so far. So I sort of wanted to fill up those gaps which have been left, by the others. There's no point in writing something which has been repeated over and over again. I want to write something new, something unique to me. So that's the reason for that.
Thank you so much, Upali. Did you find yourself, where do you actually look for inspiration is also my question. I mean, where are you finding these stories? Are they in your circles? Are they among people you know? Or do you look to the broader world in a sense?
Actually, when I wrote my first novel, that was a 4-generational saga which covered, which had the theme of the Sri Lankan society changing over a time period of about 70 years and over over 4 generations of one single family, which covered um, uh, uh, the environment in a village, going to a town, then to a city, and then overseas and back again. But since then, the novels I have written since then, they all came from my own imagination. So they are not related to anybody I have known.
I'm sure we're glad for the disclaimer. Thank you. Thank you, Pali. Vihanga, I'd like to come to you at this point. I mean, I was listening to an interview where you said you went through 16 drafts of a novel, and I winced in sympathy. But I thought also that the final product must have been, must have evolved to be so much richer because of that process. And I wondered what attitude you go into editing with, and whether you have a clear sense of what you would like the final product to be, or whether the writing just evolves as you go along.
Yeah, I think that reference to the novel, that is something I worked on around 2010, 2011. It was a book called The Fear of Gambling, which in spite of the 16 drafts, only 3 people read. So yeah, but I'm all right. I think in that particular case, it was largely to do with the actual structure and the form of the narrative. It was a bit of an experimental, non-linear kind of text that kept moving among multiple spaces. So I think I was being a bit overcautious, a bit too careful with it. But that would be an extreme case because most of the times I would work multiple drafts, but it would not come to 16, maybe 7, 8 drafts. As for your question on how the writing process goes, very often I just let the writing take me forward. And this is true to both the thematic and plot concerns as well as the form of the delivery. So what I mean is there are so many times where I start writing something thinking that it's a poem that I write, but it might end up as a short story or as a novel. So it has happened, including some of the sections of the Gratiaen shortlisted manuscript. There is this section called The Private Funeral, which I think about 8 or 9 years ago, I started writing that as a short story. And then later on, I rechurned it as a kind of a verse performance, a performance piece running on verse. So I think, yeah, and also I'm largely a self-published writer. So what that means is my writing has a kind of a set routine during the writing phase as well as the post-production phase. For the writing phase, I would work revisions, then I would employ a couple of people I can have that kind of conversation with to give me feedback as I work on. And once that is done, I would actually get an editor, someone who kind of meets my requirements to actually go through it and give me feedback. And I use a small press, which is not very far from where I live. I have been using this press for about 12 years. So it's a kind of a expanded but not too complicated process.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Just having had a chance to just briefly talk to you all about your process in your book, I'd like to now switch to the Gratiaen Prize itself. And Andrew, my question is for you, really. I mean, this is a prize that celebrates Sri Lankans writing in Sri Lanka, resident in Sri Lanka, writing in English. And why do you think the being resident and the writing in English in particular need this kind of support?
I mean, I think there are two kind of, a lot of the novels or the kind of very popular and successful works that have come, that have been about Sri Lanka have sometimes tended to be written by writers who live overseas, by Sri Lankans who live overseas. And I think Sri Lankans who are resident, writers who are resident in Sri Lanka face a couple of, I think, disadvantages in terms of not being able to sort of leverage their work into kind of a publishing scenario. So publishers are less likely for whatever reason, to take on resident writers. Maybe it's the size of the market. Often when, you know, you're writing or living in the US or the UK, sometimes the US and UK publishers get into, are accessible to you in a way that probably they aren't to us. So there's that side of things. And there's also the fact that when you're resident here, what you write, you know, censorship does exist in Sri Lanka. People, if you write something critically and you live in Sri Lanka, you kind of have to deal with the fallout of that in a much more real and kind of day-to-day way than you might if you were living overseas as well. And so I think those kind of disadvantages that are there. And I mean, for me personally, my book is kind of a strange genre. I'm so glad that it qualifies for this award, that you know, that it's that there's an award that kind of recognizes Sri Lankan writing in this way, and I'm hugely grateful for that chance.
Oh, that's lovely. Praveen, I'd like to go to you next. I mean, this is your first time on the shortlist. I'm sure it won't be your last. But I'd love to hear from you. What would you suggest to someone that wants to follow in your footsteps, to another young reader who's considering applying? What are your tips? What has been the process of applying for the Gratian been like for you?
I think that if you have a manuscript, or if you have something that you think is that you're relatively confident in, I think that you should go for it, because there's really not much that you can lose. So I think that if you think you have a good manuscript, if you think that you might have a chance, or even if you don't, you really should apply, because the process itself is not that hard. You had to fill a few you had to fill a few forms and send it in, but other than that, there's really not that many hurdles to actually applying, which I think is great.
You know, I was just thinking, listening to you, that part of the challenge for someone might be imposter syndrome, this feeling that you are not as, you know, not good enough to apply for such a thing, and not that it's better to not even try than to risk failure. And I was wondering how you address that for yourself.
If you wrote something, you should have confidence in it, because you wrote it. At the end of the day, no one can really subtract from that. No one can, take away what you created. And if you do write something, you tend to have a bit of pride in that. And I think that people should recognize that, and not be scared of what other people think. Definitely take in comments, but for something like the Gratiaen Prize, something where you have the possibility, like a real possibility of getting recognized, you definitely should, and not particularly be afraid of that.
Thank you, Praveen. Upali, I mean, Praveen is just encouraging people to apply, and of course, what people might not know is that you can submit even an unpublished manuscript for the Gratiaen Prize. And I know you've submitted both published manuscripts and unpublished manuscripts in the past. I'm curious whether you feel there's an advantage to maybe submitting an unpublished manuscript. Why would you consider doing that?
There's no particular advantage in submitting an unpublished manuscript. It's just that most new writers can't find somebody to sponsor him or her to do the publication. So it's great that the Gratiaen Trust accepts manuscripts, so that, if that was good enough, that is a place where they can prove themselves. If that's good enough, and if that manuscript gets long-listed, short-listed, or win, that would give them a credit to get their works published by a good publisher.
Upali, I'd like to ask you, I mean, I've read the citations that each of you received upon making it to the shortlist. I mean, what role do you feel like the judges' comments have in this place between you having submitted an unpublished manuscript and you taking that through to publishing? Do you think you'll take on board what the judges have said?
Yeah, if I have a chance, yes, certainly I would do that. But most of the time, the comments which have come, at least the last time the comments I had got were all positive. So I didn't have to change a thing between that and getting it published. But certainly, you know, if there are any comments, certainly I would like to have them and then get those things addressed before going to publication.
Thank you, Pali. So Vihanga, you're the only one in this crowd that actually knows what it's like to take home the Gratiaen Prize, which you did in 2014. I was wondering if you'd be willing to reflect on what that meant for you at that time, both personally and professionally.
So if I look at it on hindsight, so it's the difference of what I was doing touching 30 and what I'm doing now mid 30s. What I wanted my writing to be, or where I wanted to take it, it's very different from where I am today. But looking back, I would say that in terms of your development as a writer and the kind of confidence it instills in you, well, winning the Gratiaen, which is always a bonus for me, definitely being in the short list of the Gratiaen, it's a big confidence booster. I think it is also, in a way, a kind of a citation, a kind of acclamation you have for the work you have been doing. So it helps you to kind of hit a stride, build up momentum. So in those ways, definitely I would say the Gratiaen is a big push, and this kind of platform makes it even better.
And personally, it also must allow you a chance to really engage with other writers and with the literati, as it were.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I met Fidel earlier, but definitely Upali and Praveen, this is the first time I'm engaging with them. I have this little anecdote. I'll just take half a minute over this. So this was 2008 Gratiaen shortlist. I was in that. And this is the shortlist where, for the first time in history, to an unsuspecting audience and in manuscript form, Shehan Karunatilaka made an appearance with Chinaman, right? So the rest is history, right? So I was seated with Shehan Karunatilaka, and over the last 10 years, I've been thinking, looking back, if I had actually won the 2008 Gratiaen Prize, I wouldn't have, but if I had really won it, I would probably never forgive myself for the rest of my life, right? So yeah, that's my shortlist anecdote. Yeah, but definitely.
Thank you so much.
Definitely, I agree with you. It's very good for networking and also building connections with other people in the trade. It's always very important to exchange ideas to keep track of what is happening around you. Yeah.
What you say about community brings me so nicely to my last question for you all, which is that from what I've seen, it really takes so many people working together to produce a really good book. And it's not just the judges for the Gratiaen or the production teams at your editorial houses, but also your friends and family and the people who make space for you in all the days and hours that come before. And so my question to you really is, if you were to win the prize this year, who would be the first person you would call and who would be happiest for you? Perhaps maybe we could start with Upali.
Well, you know, my wife would be the person who would be happiest if I won it. And then I wouldn't have to call her because she would be sitting next to me in that event. And after that, of course, you know, my friends who have been encouraging me and who have been doing some reviews for me, I would be contacting them.
Vihanga, it sounds like it might be the same for you.
Well, in addition to other people who work with me, definitely my partner, who is also a very, I would say, the most fierce critic of my work. The work of half a year, she can just bin it in half a minute. So definitely, but in a good way. I mean, a good way that criticism is welcome. And also, I have a feeling my mother, who is never intrusive in my work, who has patiently watched me going bankrupt over these publications over a lifetime. So I have a feeling in a strange way, she might also feel good if something positive comes out.
Oh, lovely. Andrew?
Yeah, I think similar for me. My wife, for sure, without a doubt. Actually, the book was mostly written while my wife was pregnant with our son. And Erna, she puts up with all my moods if writing hasn't gone well, and I'm kind of moping around the house. She's the one who has to put up with it, and she would be extremely happy, and in some ways more outwardly excited than me, probably.
How old is your son now, Andrew?
He's 2.5.
Oh, Praveen, who would you call?
It would probably be a tie between my parents and my teachers. My parents have definitely been a big part of it, a big part of supporting me, and yeah, I think, and after that maybe a few friends, but yeah, I think my parents would be really happy for me. Yeah,
I love it, and I'm sure your English teacher will be really proud as well. I think that brings us actually to a lovely conclusion to this panel. I want to thank Upali, Vihanga, Andrew, and Praveen for joining us and for their honest and funny answers. And I'd like to wish you guys the best of luck. I'm sure this is going to be a really close run competition. Thank you also to our audience for joining us. I hope that you will come back on the 4th of July to find out who is going to be taking home the Gratiaen Prize. Thank you, everyone.